This program is brought to you by Emory University.
We have another approach, too, that has characterized much of the U.S.-China Forum to date, and that is the Field of Dreams approach. We build it, and they will come. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sita Ranchad-Nilsson. I direct the Institute for Developing Nations here at Emory. The Institute is a partnership between Emory University and the Carter Center to connect scholarship to the Carter Center's work in peace and health programs in a variety of ways. 2 years ago, IDN signed on as a collaborating partner to the China program's China-Africa initiative. At that time, the focus was on finding ways to strengthen and grow mutual understanding, particularly between African communities and African organizations and governments and China. The focus was also, I think, on kind of a secondary focus was on this tripartite collaboration that we've been hearing a lot about over the last day and a half, and that is as we look to a new era of U.S.-China relations and cooperation, how might connections with Africa be a place in which that collaboration can be strengthened? So 2 years ago, when we signed on, I talked to my colleagues here at Emory and the Carter Center, and one of the things everybody wanted was to hear from Deborah Brautigam. And it's taken us about that long to get her to come because of her very, very busy schedule. Indeed, she shared with me last night that after her book, Gift of the Dragon, was published, she did 52 speaking engagements in the course of that first year, and I don't think she slowed down much since then. Deborah Brautigam is a professor of international development and comparative politics at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. She also directs their international development program. She is very well known for the book, her entire body of research, but I think especially for those who are interested in China's engagement in Africa and what that means for a changing development landscape, for her book, Gift of the Dragon. I'm very pleased that her visit to Emory coincides with the U.S.-China Forum that has been organized by the Carter Center and the Holly Institute, and I want to express my appreciation to the organizers for working with us to get all the pieces to go together very smoothly. The forum, just so you know, we have a mixed audience here today. We have people who have been attending the forum, who have been together for a day, or in some cases a day and a half at this point, discussing what the new era of U.S.-China collaboration looks like, how we can strengthen collaboration and understanding moving into the future. And surprising to some, but not to everyone, is that Africa was a central part of that conversation, with a lot of emphasis on what tripartite collaboration, and I should say, when I say that collaboration between U.S., China, and Africa, that this is it's tripartite in terms of collaboration, but I think the understanding is that it's very much a demand-driven collaboration that is driven by the needs and priorities of African countries. So that has been a central part of the discussion. I'm happy that we're able to continue that today with Professor Brautigam. I want you to be aware that we are joined in this session by many members of the Emory community, and I welcome you, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to have this discussion together. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Professor Brautigam. After she makes remarks, I'm very pleased that Professor Jagdish Sheth is going to be moderating the question and answer period, and following that, at the very end, my colleague Sean Ding from the Carter Center has a few announcements. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Deborah Brautigam.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the Carter Center and Emory University for inviting me here for the past 3 days. It's been just fascinating and a great opportunity to meet so many new people and friends. So let me just start. China and Africa, Think Again. That's what my presentation's called. And I say think again because I think so much of what we think already, and I'm speaking of generalists, is pretty negative about what the Chinese are doing in Africa. And this really hit me in about 2006, when a lot of newspaper covers started coming out and alarming images of the new colonialists in Africa, or that China was taking over Africa, or that China was a threatening presence and Africa really needed to wake up to this threat. Well, as someone said earlier today about the China-U.S. engagement, that he was a realistic optimist, I'm a realistic optimist about China's engagement in Africa. And I think I can say that because I have some background in this issue. So the alarming picture is out there. This is not particularly about Africa, but I think it's that there's a lot we don't understand about China. And that's very true in Africa as well. But there's a lot that we do understand. So I've been working on this for a long time. I went to Africa in 1983 as a China student. So I was a sinologist. I still am. And I did my PhD fieldwork on what the Chinese were doing in Africa. So this particular picture, we've got, that's me there, just in case you weren't sure. I'm doing interviews with a Chinese technician who's working on an aid project in Liberia. And in the back is a Liberian driving the combine harvester. So here's another picture, and yes, that's me in the middle. So I know I've changed over the past 30 years, but this gives you my bona fides for this. And I've written 2 books on this topic, as you've heard, The Dragon's Gift, and my earlier book, which sank like a stone after it was published. I think it maybe sold 300 copies to libraries, which was on Chinese aid and African development at a time when nobody was interested in this. It came out in the 90s. So I often tell a story, and I think I wasn't going to tell you this story, but I'm going to anyway because I think it helps frame a lot of how the Chinese think about Africa. And so it begins once upon a time. And once upon a time, there was a very large, poor, but resource-rich country just emerging from a period of intense conflict. And this country decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure, they said. We need to modernize our mines and our ports. And soon they had a visit from a wealthy Asian power that had already become a major consumer of their oil. And this major power said to them, "We'll give you a bargain. We'll offer you a line of credit worth $10 billion. And you can use that credit to have our companies export materials and equipment to you. Our companies can help you develop your ports and your mines. And you can repay us with your oil." Now, many in this poor country were very concerned about this deal. And it was negotiated over a period of years. But finally, they agreed and the work began. Now, when I tell this story, I usually stop here and I say, do you know who these 2 countries might be? And usually, people say, yes, they know one of these countries, China. And I say, that's good. Yeah, China was one of those countries, doing well. And then usually they guess for the other country, Angola, Sudan, DRC, so on and so forth. And I see people in the audience nodding. But I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is the other country was Japan. China was the large, poor country with oil just emerging from the Cultural Revolution, a period of intense conflict. The Chinese decided to focus on development, and Japan was there. Now, Japan and China were not close friends. This arrangement was not foreign aid. This was a commercial arrangement, but it was based on mutual benefit. The Japanese could export to China. China, which had no access to international credit markets, could build its infrastructure using higher technology and better equipment from Japan. And they could pay for it with what they had, which was their oil and their coal. Now, I tell you this story because it frames a lot of the way that the Chinese look at Africa. And it also shows the opportunities that are available for Africans who want to take advantage of that possibility for a mutually beneficial arrangement. It's not easy. It's not always straightforward. It involves a lot of negotiation, as China did with Japan. But for countries that want to take charge and use their assets to move forward when they can't access credit on the international markets, this is an opportunity. So let me keep on. When we talk about China and Africa, we're often talking in very large groups. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversations where people say, China, India, and Africa. Now, these three countries, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Africa is 54 countries. So when we talk about Africa, are we talking about the military in Egypt? Are we talking about labor unions in South Africa? Are we talking about Equatorial Guinea, a very rich but very poor country? The parliament in Ghana? Sonangol, the state-owned oil company in Angola? There are a lot of different Africas that we're talking about. And in China, is it the Communist Party? Is it traders from Zhejiang? Is it China National Petroleum Corporation, big SOE? Is it people from Hong Kong who are now coming out and also coming fast into Africa? Is it the Ministry of Commerce? There are a lot of different actors. They don't all have the same interests. They don't all act the same way. In order to understand the relationship, we need to understand these different parts. Now, China's interest in Africa is very real. There's no mistaking that. Africa is not the biggest area of Chinese interest. A lot of people in Africa think that it is, but it's not. The Chinese are much more interested in the United States and in Europe. And even for natural resources, country by country, they're interested much more in Australia than any African country. But the interest is very real, and the top-level visits have been frequent. And it does present some real concerns, and I'll lay a few of those out. For example, and this is all documented, the Chinese are importing illegally harvested timber from countries in Africa. We can see this in Mozambique, in Gabon, in Tanzania. There's a lot of evidence about this. It's a problem. Rich Chinese are buying items made out of ivory. This is also a problem. And I think China has in the past, and it's getting better now, but in the past presented a difficulty for our diplomacy in trying to work on human rights issues because of China's policy of non-interference. So this has been a problem as well. And Chinese companies that have been released from their ministries are now trying to do business all around the world, and they're selling small arms. So they're becoming the largest small arms exporter to Africa. And in a situation where there are lots of conflicts, this is not a helpful role. And Africans have a lot of concerns. For example, they're concerned about Chinese goods coming in and flooding their markets and wiping out their local industries. And there's a lot of evidence in the textile industry that this has happened. They're also concerned about small-scale Chinese traders coming in and competing with them. They've been facing this kind of competition for a long time. They've had Lebanese there, they've had Indians there, they've had Africans coming from one country to trade in another country. That's been a common feature, but they haven't had Chinese in this kind of role before, and they haven't had so many all at one time coming quickly. But I think the major concerns that I hear about are labor relations. And these are cultural conflicts, different expectations of how work should be done, how long work should be done, what kinds of safety standards should be in place, what kinds of protection. So those are the things I hear when I'm in Africa. And then lack of transparency. So there's a lot of business going on, and business is often untransparent, but the Chinese government is much less transparent than others about its export credit agencies and its official aid. Nonetheless, we do know a lot, and we know a lot more than a lot of people think we know. And so I want to strip away some of the myths here. And the first is that we often think that China is a newcomer in Africa, that they're a latecomer, that they just got there because of their desperate search for resources. That's actually not the case. I think most people in this room probably know that. So raise your hand if you didn't know that. No, I'm just going to embarrass you here. Okay, so is China a newcomer in Africa? The answer is no, and let me show you just how long ago the Chinese first got to Africa. Now, this is one of my favorite maps here. It's a map of the voyages of Zheng He, and every Chinese in the room knows about Zheng He. He was an admiral, very interesting guy. He was a Muslim, he was a eunuch, and he led the Chinese fleets out into the Indian Ocean, and they stopped in Africa. And the Chinese, including my friend He Wenping, I don't know if she's here today, but they're often fond of saying that the Chinese only took back one giraffe to show to the emperor, and that's all they took from Africa. In fact, what they also took were a lot of plants because they were very interested in Africa for their pharmaceutical explorations. Now, this is the size of the fleets, and I love this picture because it shows the perspective of Zheng He's boats, which were these big ones in the back, and then this little tiny boat in the front. Does anyone recognize what that might be? Yeah, it's Christopher Columbus's, the size of his boats. So when we're thinking about the China threat, if they'd gone head-to-head in the oceans at that point, you can see who probably would have won. Now, the Chinese did go away after the Ming Dynasty. As we know, China closed down, turned inward. But then they came back again after the PRC was founded. And in the first years, it was all about supporting socialism and socialist brothers. So it was in Tanzania, Guinea, other places with socialist leaders. But that very quickly changed. And these are all the pictures, yes, of Mao and with his friends in Algeria and other people in the non-aligned movement. But that socialist brotherhood quickly changed into a more pragmatic approach. And the pragmatic approach came out of the diplomatic battle with Taiwan, in which the Chinese were trying to get into the United Nations. And so they had a lot of aid programs, which were gifts in part out of their economic diplomacy. And so by 1975, the Chinese had aid programs in more countries in Africa than the United States did. And this happened because they could aid all the socialist countries, and then they aided all the countries that recognized them and stepped over from Taiwan. And that was more countries than the United States was dealing with at that point. So, and you can see here the iconic Tanzam Railway that was built that again, I think every Chinese knows about this project. So, by the 1990s, Chinese interest in Africa was growing and growing, and visits kept on coming. These were not just a new thing in 2006, but Chinese presidents and premiers have been going to Africa for a long time. And in this map, which comes from my book, my last book, it shows the countries that Chinese presidents or premiers, the top two leaders, have visited since 1995. And some of them are multiple visits, so each symbol is one leader. And you can see like Egypt has gotten 4 of these visits. South Africa has also gotten 4. So President Obama, our past presidents go much more rarely, or vice presidents, to Africa. It's just not been very much on our radar screen. So this is about a lot more than just natural resources. So let me go into that. A lot of people think the Chinese just want to go to Africa to extract natural resources. And I'm not saying that they're not interested in that. They're hugely interested in that. But that's not what it's not only about that. So strategic diplomacy is still important. There is a truce with Taiwan, as a lot of people know, but this is the flag of Taiwan. 4 countries in Africa still recognize Taiwan, and there's been a lot of diplomatic back and forth over the past decade up until the truce. There are also other diplomatic issues, and the Chinese will put pressure on South Africa to never grant a visa to the Dalai Lama, which has happened twice now. And then there are other issues that come up at the United Nations. And the Chinese like to have 54 friends in Africa that might vote with them on different issues that are of concern to them. They're also interested in the WTO and getting the non-market status designation removed from China and having it be recognized as a country that has market status. And this comes up often in the diplomatic negotiations in Africa. But business, in a broad sense, is the most important driver. And we see this, this is one of the pictures that I took in Mauritius, which is a small island nation in the Indian Ocean. And I thought it was interesting that it's a former British colony. And this is a thing of airlines. And the top one was British Airways, which you would expect. But look what comes next. The next is Cathay Pacific, and then Dragonair, and then Air Madagascar. And so I took that because I think it represents some of the changes going on in Africa and that relationship with Asia. Now, trade is really big. These are exports to Africa from China, and you can see from 2000 to 2010 just how much that's gone up by multiples. And here's, for comparison, the United States. And one of the reasons why we feel that we're losing a little bit is that in 2000, we had twice as many exports as China did, and by 2010, they had twice as many as we did. Now, imports from Africa. The Chinese are also very interested, and most of this is natural resources, at least 80%, 80 to 90% is raw materials and commodities. And here's the United States. Now, we import more than the Chinese do from Africa, and 80% is oil. And then above that, we also have other raw materials. But most of the raw materials that we consume from Africa are actually channeled first through China. Then they're processed into manufactured goods, and then we buy them, because we aren't producing as much the raw materials. This is another area that is huge, infrastructure contracts. And if you look at the amount, this is the revenues that Chinese companies are reporting from their infrastructure work in Africa. In 2003, it was under $5 billion, and by 2010, it was $35 billion. So this is the turnover that they're getting each year from these infrastructure contracts. And at this point, the Chinese, since 2000, have built 60,000 kilometers of roads in Africa, and they put up power plants generating 3.5 million kilowatt hours of capacity. So that's a lot of infrastructure that's been done by Chinese companies. And they're getting about a third of the Chinese contracts that are gained overseas are now done in Africa. So this is a big area for Chinese business. And there are a lot of needs in Africa. This is a road that some may think this is one that collapsed after it was built by the Chinese, but that's not the case. This was a road that was built, that was devastated by the war in Liberia. So there are needs of war reconstruction, and the Chinese have been very active in rebuilding roads in Liberia. This is a picture that I took in Tanzania, and it's just it's an upcountry road. They're building a bridge there. And if you can see closely what's happening here, there's one Chinese manager. Everybody else, of course, is a Tanzanian, which is how it usually works. It's not true that the Chinese bring in all their own workers for these projects. And so this one, but you can also see that the Tanzanian workers are not wearing uniforms, they're not wearing protective clothing. And I have another picture that shows some of the Tanzanians, they're actually barefoot doing this work. So these are not proper construction standards, and this is an area of criticism that's quite legitimate. And here's a power plant that the Chinese had been involved in. This is a picture I took in Sierra Leone. It's a lot of building construction. This was actually built in 1983. When I was first there, and the Chinese, after the war, went back and they replaced all of the tiles on the outside and replaced the elevators and refurbished the building, which is housing a lot of ministries in Sierra Leone. And these are other projects that I took these pictures in Tanzania, but they're commercial and government buildings, and none of these were financed by the Chinese government in this particular instance. And it's not just buildings and roads and power plants, but fiber optic networks, wind farms, telecommunications towers. And indeed, the cell phone revolution in Africa is largely being carried on hardware and infrastructure that's been set up by Huawei and Zhongxin Telecommunications, Chinese firms. And who's financing this? It really is not mostly the Chinese government. It's all sorts of different actors. And I would say the Chinese government finances about 20 to 25% of this business in any given year. What about foreign direct investment? How much of this is going to Africa? We don't know. That's the short answer. I just came from a conference at Princeton where we were complaining about the lack of data or good data on Chinese overseas foreign direct investment. It's not really the fault of MOFCOM. They do publish this data, but it's bad data. And it's bad because this is where the Chinese FDI is going out as its first port of call. And this shows the largest place they're going is Hong Kong. So once it goes into Hong Kong, that's an overseas financial center. We can't track it after that as being uniquely Chinese. It's also going into the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and so forth. So this is money that can't easily be tracked. And some of that will then come into Africa. Why do the Chinese do this? It's not because there's some nefarious scheme to try to hide their OFDI. It's because they have capital controls. And so once companies get their money outside of the border, and Hong Kong is considered outside of the border, they can move it much more freely. They don't have to get a license or permission to make an investment. And if they have earnings, they keep them offshore as well. And so that's where a lot of the FDI is coming from, those offshore financial centers. If China opened up its capital controls, we'd have a lot better data on where the OFDI is coming from. Now, according to the official data, which is not good, this is the amount going into Africa. And you can see in 2008, there was one blip up. There's a larger amount. So the yellow at the top of these columns is what's going into Africa. So you can see it's also not that much. It's bigger than this, but it's not bigger in a huge multitude bigger. So this is, again, comparing the official data, which is not good, with the U.S. data to Africa, which is not as good as we would like. So the U.S. is still, according to the official data, larger, except in 2008, which was a unique year, and I'll show you that. But we have problems with the transparency of the U.S. data as well. I think we have a good idea of the overall data that's going into Africa as a continent, but we don't know how much is going in country by country, because a lot of that data happens to be confidential. So what about China's largest investment in Africa so far? You might guess it's a copper mine or an oil investment or something along those lines. So far, the largest completed investment where the money has actually been transferred and is a done deal is a bank. So it's 20% of Standard Bank. Now, think back what I've just been talking about. Why would China's ICBC, the largest commercial bank in China, industrial and commercial bank of China, why would they buy 20% of South Africa's Standard Bank? It's about the business. It's about learning from a partner who's very active in Africa about how to get financing contracts, how to make loans, how to do syndicated loans. And they've been actively involved now in Standard Bank's business and learning very rapidly how to do this. Now, another thing that people often believe is that Chinese aid is huge. And I've seen things like that China gives 3 times as much aid as the West to Africa. That's all the West. Well, in the year that this claim was made, the West gave $120 billion in aid to Africa, if you include everybody. And the Chinese gave about $2 billion. So that was in 2008. Chinese aid is not huge, and I think one of the reasons why people make this claim, as what happened in a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, where they said in 2011 that the Chinese had given $189 billion in aid, that was what they allocated in 2011. And the actual figure for 2011 is even including the concessional loans, which are subsidized out of the aid budget, is probably about $10.5 billion worldwide. So why do they think it was so large? Well, the methodology was, I think, one that was really flawed. What they did is they collected media reports of everything that had anything to do with the Chinese government. And then they said, well, we don't really know if this is aid or not, so we'll just say if it's connected to the government, we'll just call it aid. And this was done by researchers at RAND, which you think for the Department of Defense. And so I joked about this as saying that at least our Department of Defense thinks that China's putting its money into aid rather than the defense budget. So maybe they'll relax a little bit about the China threat. But actually, the aid budget is a real budget. It's not, and it is actually fairly transparent, and it's not nearly that large. And it doesn't do any service to our understanding to try to paint it as though it's an enormous program. What is bigger, though, is export credits. These don't qualify as official development assistance, but they are out there. Most of the ones that are going into Africa are not subsidized. They are at LIBOR, London Interbank Offered Rates, plus a margin. And it's going up from China Commercial Bank, or China Development Bank. Their credits are almost LIBOR plus 3%, which is quite a bit higher than some market rate syndicated loans in Africa. So out of this, you can see again the growth in China Exim Bank. This is about the export machine. It's about selling Chinese goods. It's about financing Chinese companies. The amount that goes to African governments or any government is that narrow part of the export buyer's credits. Everything else is going to Chinese companies to drive their business. And that's how our export credit agency works as well. It's not about foreign aid either. It's just a lot smaller than the Chinese. Now, another thing I often hear is that China's leading the land grab in Africa. And this, you might be interested in this. It comes from the Hindustan Times, in which they said, India's joining the race for land in Africa, China way ahead. Well, I spent a year about a year and a half ago, I was at the International Food Policy Research Institute for a year as a visiting fellow. And one of my projects there was to look at the media reports about Chinese engagement in land in Africa. And so we did this very systematically. We took the 25 largest cases, and we looked into each one of them. And we did this through field work. We did this through our partners who were located in African countries. And then we did it through checking into media reports a little more deeply. And I'll give you just one example from these media reports. One of them said that the Chinese had a $2 billion rice investment in Nigeria. Having been to Nigeria many times, I thought this was a little unlikely because it's not a great agricultural country, and then it's not a great rice producer either. But anyway, I looked into it, and it took me about 5 minutes of internet sleuthing to figure this one out. So yes, there was an article that said the Chinese had a $2 billion rice investment in Africa, but there was a name of a company there. So I did a little more checking on the name of the company, and I found it was called Ofada VT. And so I looked Ofada VT. Ofada, turns out, is rice. It's Yoruba for rice. VT, it turns out, is VT Basmati, which you might think is an Indian company, and sure enough, it turns out it was an Indian company. So it's an Indian company, not Chinese. A little more looking, and I found it's not $2 billion, it's 2 billion naira, which is about $17 million. And then the last thing was, it's not to grow rice, it's to sell rice mills and to set up rice mills for milling rice in Nigeria. And so it's a very different story, but that's not what made it into the databases about Chinese land grabs. And there are many more cases like that. And in fact, we had, what was the amount that we had? If we totaled up all the land that the Chinese had supposedly grabbed, it was 7.6 billion, no, 7.6 million, I don't want to get it wrong there, 7.6 million hectares. That's what all the media reports said. And out of those 25 projects, we only found 4 that had happened in the past decade and were actually real and actually had land. There were some that were earlier than 2000, but that doesn't seem like a recent land investment. And they weren't that big either. But of those 4, and the actual amount of land that had been developed was less than 10,000 hectares. They had some plans for larger, but so far they hadn't been carried out. So it's there is interest in agriculture, but most Chinese companies are finding it's a very difficult area. Now, another thing that we often think is that China Inc., it's China Incorporated. It's someone in Beijing reaching out and manipulating everything and happening all like that from China. Well, there's a saying in China that it goes, 上高皇帝远. 你们听得懂吗? It means the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And this is a saying that they say in whether the capital is in Beijing or Nanjing or wherever the capital happens to be. It's hard to control what happens out in the provinces. And if you can imagine it's hard within China, it's even harder from Beijing all the way to Africa. And so I'll tell you one story. We often hear China's doing this, China's doing that. And in the DRC, there was a very large negotiation over a copper, it's one of these commodity-backed infrastructure packages again. It's supposed to be $3 billion investment in a copper mine, and then another $3 billion in infrastructure that would be secured with the proceeds from the copper mine, but not connected to the copper mine. And then originally it was going to be another $3 billion, so $6 billion. So everyone talked about this as it's China, China doing this. Well, let's break it down into who actually did this. If you break it down, you learn a lot more about what happened there. So I talked to one of the negotiators of the original deal. He was with one of the Chinese companies, who was Sino-Hydro and China Railway Engineering Corporation. So you might wonder, why are 2 construction companies doing a mining project? And that gives you a little bit of a clue as to why this happened. So in 2003, in the DRC, these Chinese construction companies were active. They were carrying out projects, and they said, we want to get more work. We want to do more business. So they talked to the Minister of Infrastructure, and they started figuring out how can they put something together where they could get more construction business, and the DRC could pay for it because they didn't have money. So they said, well, there's this way that we can do it. You can secure a loan with a commodity export of some kind. And then that way you can use it as a mortgage and you can get the infrastructure money and then we can carry out the projects. So they thought this is win-win for the construction companies. They got the Minister of Infrastructure on board. They went to Gécamine, the mining company. They said, we have this abandoned mine that some Europeans left. It's full of water, but if you want it, you can put that into the package. And that's what they did. So they put the package together and then they brought it to Beijing. And they took it to China Exim Bank and they said, can you finance this? And they looked at it for a few years and they said, I think we can. And so this package then was financed. It's run into a lot of problems since then, but that's the short story. So what it was is Chinese construction companies wanting work, and they said, well, we can take the mine. They don't know anything about mining, so they have to bring in somebody else to do that, and that will be used, and then we can get these contracts through non-competitive bidding processes. So a lot of murky things going on there, but it's much more helpful, I think, to understand it all, to see it as these different actors than to see it as China coming in to this. Now, we're looking at China and Africa a lot of the times as part of the problem. But I think that China is where we have to also look as well as Africa. The solutions are going to come out of Africa. But China can also help, and Chinese actors can help. And here is one actor. You may recognize this tall fellow here. Yes. Yes, and he's even bigger than an elephant. Isn't that a little surprising? So this is Yao Ming in Africa. And one of these is a sweet picture of Yao Ming with a baby orphaned elephant, and the other is a not very sweet picture of Yao Ming standing in front of a dead elephant who has been killed for its tusks. And so what is this about? It's about the start of the solution, which is re-education and trying to make ivory as a negative connotation in China as it has become in Japan. Japan used to import a lot of ivory from Africa. And then a surprising thing happened. The Japanese crown prince got together with Prince Philip of the UK, and together they made a statement that ivory was not cool. You know, ivory was a really icky thing. You know, it was really bad. And so the Japanese demand for ivory went like that. And this is what needs to happen in China. And that's how the problem's going to be solved, through changes in demand there. Now, I think we have in the West, and particularly, I was saying to someone earlier today that I know Fox News is famous for having a kind of distorted picture of China-U.S. relations. I don't listen to Fox News either, but I've heard this. But I think it's my perspective sometimes that the main media in the United States has a kind of distorted perspective of China-Africa relations, and they're not getting out there and really doing the kind of good reporting that we need to have. And so there's this mask, and I don't know if you can read the small print on this, but this is Fu Manchu. I mentioned this yesterday, that a colleague of mine had done this wonderful research on how the British media was reporting China and Africa and Britain in Africa. And she called her article Fu Manchu, which is about the Chinese, how they were represented, versus Dr. Livingstone, who's the British doctor who went into Africa as the good guy in the dark continent. And I think that's a lot of the representation that we have, that we're not looking at African agency and how Africans are partners in all of this and shaping a lot of it. Instead, it's this Chinese, and this says down there, the Chinese devil man, Dr. Fu Manchu, who wanted to rule the world. Scary. But that's the representation in Africa a lot of the times. And I think this is a really distorted mirror, and it's not very helpful. And so what I see of the Chinese in Africa is reflects much more things like this. It reflects the Japanese practices in Asia and Southeast Asia, how they built these deals that they looked as being win-win, and they were largely commercial. But if you look at the infrastructure built by the Japanese around Southeast Asia, if you look at the industry that the Japanese moved offshore into Southeast Asia, a lot of the economic boom in Southeast Asia is due to that Japanese cooperation. And again, most of it was not aid, but most of it was not. It was about business. And the second thing I see when I look at the Chinese in Africa is France. And I say this because a lot of the way the French do deals in Africa involves this kind of elite-to-elite contacts, dinners between French presidents and African presidents, and then deals being announced after that. And this is very much, in fact, the Chinese would love to have the kind of access to African leaders that the French still have in a lot of countries, and even outside of the Francophone countries. So I see France, I see Japan, I see possibilities there. And I don't see Dr. Fu Manchu. So I'll end with just one point, which again goes back to my realistic optimism. I think inflating the challenge from China could be just as dangerous as underestimating it. And I think this goes for the United States and China relationship. And I think it also goes for the relationship between China and Africa and how we in the West view that. So let me end with that. Thank you.
Well, Deborah, thank you very much. Great presentation, right? Those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor in the Gozueta School of Business, and I'm in primarily the geopolitics aspect, globalization of enterprises, global competition as one of my areas of specialization. I go by nickname Jag, like in Jaguar, so please call me Jag, pretty much. And if it's okay, while you are gathering for your questions, I would probably like to raise 3-4 questions to Deborah, and then see if we can think about answers, get more out of her presence here primarily. Deborah, this was very, very enlightening. Your book is excellent, by the way. I bought the book. I read the book, okay? And you can have a quiz for me, too, okay? It's fine. So, but my main question is that what has China got out of the relationship? You all talk about what Africa has got. Let me provocatively raise the question that in most of the African deals, the recipients have outsmarted all the givers, or French, but all other nations who have contributed for African development. If you look at the history from the giver viewpoint is not that great. Have you articulated about what China has gained by investing in Africa? And we'll focus on Africa for a moment before we go into other areas. So from China viewpoint, it's a mutual benefit. Any ideas about it?
Well, thanks for that question. Thanks for your nice comments about my book. I'm glad you read it. I'm even more glad you bought it. All right, what has China gotten out of Africa? Well, I have to answer this a little bit broadly than just the investment side of it. I would say, first of all, the diplomacy, as we in the China-Africa field hear over and over again, it was African votes at the United Nations that brought China in. And so that diplomacy was really important for getting China's seat and kicking Taiwan out in 1971. So that's one thing they've gotten, and they continue to get diplomatic benefits. If you look at research that's been done about voting at the United Nations, whether you're looking at Latin American countries, African countries, you see a closer alignment now with Chinese positions on issues than on the U.S. positions on issues in many cases. And I haven't done this research, but I've seen presentations on this by others, and it's interesting. So it's still happening in terms of diplomacy. I think the business in construction, as I mentioned, is huge. A third of all the contracts are in Africa, so that's very big for the Chinese overseas construction companies. And there's a glut. There's a lot of competition in China, and so they're looking out to get that business, and that's very helpful for them. I think in terms of trade, the access to resources has been very important in keeping China's economic motor going, and that's been really big. Investment, though, I think this is an area where it's been more problematic. And I think that you can talk to Chinese companies that have, we have this idea that they're eating up Africa or taking it over. But the problem investments are, you can just list them one after another after another. Angola, problem investments. Niger and Chad, problem investments. Sudan, now they have a situation where it's two countries and the oil is in the south and their diplomacy is in the north. So there are a lot of instances in which these countries have come up against problems. And I think that has to do with it's a difficult place to invest. There are great rewards to be gained by investing in Africa, and there are big risks as well. So the Chinese are new at trying to balance that reward and risk combination. And also they do have soft budget constraints, and they don't have as much concern with the bottom line. So all of this has meant that they've gone into riskier areas and worse investments, and they've taken the things that were abandoned by other investors. And that's a lot of the assets that they have in Africa. They're not very good.
A second related question, As you know, when multinationals go abroad and do business in other countries, especially in ex-colonies, quite a few transform themselves into truly global enterprises. At a nation level, have you seen China transforming itself by its expansion, not just in Africa, of course in Asia to some extent, and in Latin America? What is happening to Chinese culture, Chinese psyche? Are they getting influenced? Let me just preface by saying, as you know, probably British got more influenced by India, even though India was a colony, so that today, for example, the most common convenient food among the British is the Indian curry. Have you done any research? Is China transforming itself by globalizing?
I think there are probably many more people in this room that are better positioned to answer that question than me about China being transformed by globalizing. But I think just in my own visits in China, it's very clear that if you go to Beijing, Shanghai, the sort of shining cities of China, that they would not be out of place. In fact, most parts of Europe and many parts of the United States would welcome looking like those new parts of Shanghai and those new parts of Beijing. They're really quite astounding. And the shopping, all of the kinds of things, the things that were so not there in 1980 when I first went to those cities. But let me pick up on some part of that, which is Chinese multinational corporations and how they've expanded overseas. This whole going global effort of China has been going on for a long time. A lot of people think that China only started to go global or Zhuochuchu in 2001 when they joined the WTO. But that was when it went into the 5-year plan in a big way. They had been going out and doing investments abroad for a long time. In 1985, for example, I was in Sierra Leone and I came across Chinese companies that were there trying to do joint ventures. And one of those Chinese companies did a joint venture in the fishing industry. And that joint venture was still going when I went back in 2007. So from 1985 to 2007, that Chinese state-owned company was still doing fishing with a Sierra Leonean partner, the same one. All those years. So this has been going and been gradually building. And so what has Africa meant for the Chinese? It's been a very good area for experimentation. So it's been experimentation. That was all coming out of the experiments as China was experimenting at home. They were trying to experiment abroad at the same time. And that was what my first book was about, if anyone's interested. So I was looking.
Packaging.
Yeah, it's all packaging. Yeah, you can see the two covers of the two books. They were really different. But that experimentation has been happening a lot in Africa. And so you have big Chinese multinational corporations like Huawei, like Zhongxin Telecommunications, like Geely, like Haier. They have all set up in Africa, and they're doing assembly there. They are selling their wares and their services, and they're finding it's quite competitive. I was in Johannesburg in January. I was there twice this year, but in January I gave a talk at Witwatersrand University, and the person who dropped me off afterwards was driving a Geely. And I said to her, why did you buy a Geely? I was just interested in her rationale. And she said, well, with my salary at the university, I could afford a used Toyota or a new Geely. So I decided to go for a new Geely. And she said, it works pretty well, except when I have the air conditioning on, I'm trying to go up a hill. So it is an area in which firms face less competition at their price point. There's not much else out there. And they're finding very big markets, as you can see from the exports going into Africa.
Question here and a question there. Yes.
Deborah, you give us a very good presentation and make us more knowledge on China's relation with Africa. Would you please give us your comment on your remark on the so-called Chinese policy to Africa aid without precondition? You see, Chinese official aid to Africa countries mostly not interfere with their domestic affairs, and mostly do not put political condition first. And many West countries' aid put political condition first. Then when they competing with Chinese government aid, they always failed. So many Western criticize Chinese policy of aid without precondition. Would you say something about this?
Oh, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. It's true that Chinese don't have many conditions on their aid. There is one, of course, and that is that you have to have diplomatic ties. So you can't be have official ties with Taiwan and then get aid from China or export credits or any other official government assistance. So that is one condition. And then another condition is that the aid is usually tied to the use of Chinese goods and services. So you can't just use that money and then try to get others to do the work. It has to be Chinese. So that aside, it is true that there aren't any political preconditions aside from the one China policy. And this, to what extent has this created problems for us? I think there's more of a sense that it's created problems and a feeling than a lot of evidence that it's created problems. If you look narrowly at aid, the Chinese don't give that much aid. What they do is more in the realm of official finance coming from CDB and China Exim Bank. And there's a lot of official finance coming from Western entities like commercial banks, but it's not coming through the government. So that's where a lot of the mix-up happens. People think that must be aid because it comes from the government. But I would say that from some of the difficulty in a place like Angola, and here's one that got famous for this kind of thing. The Chinese had a loan, which was not aid actually, but it was a loan that with no political preconditions, $2 billion. And it was given in 2004 at a time when the IMF was trying to push the Angolan government to become more transparent. And so the IMF was saying, we won't assist you, or we won't give you a line of credit unless you become more transparent. And all of the donors countries also lined up behind the IMF, and they said, we won't have a post-conflict reconstruction conference for you the way we've done everywhere else until you become more transparent. Angola is a very corrupt country. So this is it's a reasonable request, perhaps. But what nobody was really looking at, and this is something I talk about in my book, was that at the same time that the West, the official West and the IMF were all lining up to say, we won't fund Angola unless they become more transparent and manage their oil revenues better, which was, they managed them terribly and a lot of corruption. At the same time, there were multinational banks lining up to give syndicated loans to the Angolans. And billions were coming in, 6, 7, 8 billion just in a period of about 4 years. So the Chinese were there. They weren't imposing conditions. They were setting up these oil-backed loans. And all of these Western banks were there. They weren't imposing conditions, and they were also setting up these oil-backed loans. So it was a very crowded room. And so there was no way that these governance requirements were going to be followed by the Angolans when they had so many different sources of finance. Now, Angola may be a special case because they could access capital on international markets. Not a lot of other countries can't do that. And so in those instances, we may be facing more problems with governance conditionality. But there aren't very many other examples where you can see that our efforts to thwart bad governance were countermanded by the Chinese. You could look at Sudan, but that's not a case of funding. It's a case of oil companies already there that didn't leave. Chinese, Indian, Malaysian, they all stayed because they weren't subject to sanctions. And so they continued to provide funds to the Sudanese government through the oil revenues because these were joint ventures. In the case of Zimbabwe, again, the Chinese they haven't put very much finance into Zimbabwe. So they have invested, but again, not nearly as much as we think. So I think those two cases, I talk about them both in the book, those provide the most evidence that we have about Chinese engagement thwarting Western efforts, along with Angola, to try to impose better governance or human rights conditions. And I think they're problematic. The Chinese didn't play a positive role in Sudan up until after the Beijing Olympics. And I think it was through civil society pressure. And I think in Zimbabwe, there's been much less involvement. The Zimbabweans actually, I had lunch with the former Minister of Finance for Zimbabwe, Tendai Biti, a few weeks ago, and he told me, we could not get very much money from the Chinese, and they kept just telling us, you have to repay your old loans before we'll give you new loans. And he said it was really hard. So that relationship is a little bit different than I think we often think.
Let me pick up another question from there, or a comment.
I have a question, but first I want to thank Deborah for this wonderful presentation, and we learned a lot. Like Jed, I bought the book, I read it, but I've gone further. I let my students to read it and do research on this issue, together with reading many other different opinions. My question is really about this, what you describe, the myth of Chinese influx or Chinese coming, 中国人来了. Kind of like to what extent this myth or reality has generated or fueled the kind of other countries, particular major powers like the Europeans, the United States, India, Japan, that there is a de facto or increasing competition to go into Africa, and to what extent this has benefited African countries when now they perhaps have more choices in picking those different foreign FDI. And I'm asking this question because until recently, the image of Africa in the world, at least in the English-speaking world, is out of Africa. I remember this is an Oscar movie about 10 years ago, or at least the Hotel Rwanda, that Westerners are getting out of Africa. Now the Chinese went in, and then create this either a real growth or imagined growth. So how does it affect other countries' competing effort? Thank you.
That's such a good question, and it's absolutely the case. I think that the Chinese interest, which was there earlier, we've been seeing a lot in the newspapers more recently about Africa's turnaround, the Africa Rising. The Economist had a cover story with that message. And it's true that a lot of things are looking better in a lot of countries. There have been some governance improvements. There have been policy improvements. This has taken a long time, but it's looking a lot better. And the Chinese were there a lot earlier. And what they kept saying was that the policy environment is better, the investment environment is better, and that's why we're going in now. So they were responding to those. Before, a lot of other countries, firms had really picked up on the fact that it was changing, because they were still looking at the Economist cover from 2006, which said, a failed continent. So that was a message that they still had. So this sense of Africa as an investment destination is really turning around, and the Chinese have, I think, been very much part of making that switch and making other competitors come back again to see what the Chinese were seeing there. Now, I can see also some specific changes in how, for example, official U.S. engagement in Africa, how this is changing as a result of Chinese activity. When President Obama was in Africa recently, he announced the Power Africa initiative, which is going to be, it's a very interesting initiative. It's supposed to be over $7 billion. It involves a combination of public and private money, and it's over 5 years. So $1 billion of that each year will come out of our Exim Bank, and it's supposed to support power projects in Africa. So I mentioned before that the Chinese have already funded 3.5 million kilowatt hours of power generation capacity in Africa. So now we're going to join them. And this is critical. There's so many power needs still in Africa that 3.5 million kilowatt hours is just a drop in the bucket. So this Power Africa initiative comes, I think, purely out of seeing what the Chinese were doing and how their engagement in infrastructure was making such a difference and was so appreciated. And now we're finally getting into that area, way, way longer, way, way behind the Chinese engagement. So those kinds of things.
Let me then follow up on that one. As you know, I analyze the India's initiative in Africa. Both, for example, the Indian government in 2008, April, hosted 10 heads of Africa in New Delhi and announced $500 million aid however you define the aid. And it is probably exceeded by 1 billion now. You go to Kenya today, from the new airport, for example, to the downtown, on both sides, miles and miles, those are all Indian corporations and Indian factories. Investment in South Africa by India, for example, especially Tata's, or by ONGC, the Oil Indian State Enterprise, you know. India also investing in Africa, US investing in Africa, China being there, that becomes the playground, like dividing the areas, geography, like East Africa versus South Africa versus Middle Africa versus West Africa. What do you see in terms of this trilateral play that is happening in Africa?
Well, I don't see a new colonialism. I think there's been a lot of talk about the Chinese as being neo-colonialist powers in Africa, but that was truly a division of the continent into different areas, and I don't see that happening. The Chinese really, they're literally everywhere. And if you look at where China gives its aid, it's spread across the whole continent, except for the countries that recognize Taiwan. And if you look at where Chinese are investing, you look at where they're getting contracts, it's all over, and it varies.
The map showed that, actually.
Well, the diplomatic ties, it's over. It must be exhausting because it's really, they're going all over. So I don't see that there's the kind of a hiving off as you know, the Indian engagement has been, I haven't followed this closely, but I've seen it happening more along the coast, the East Coast, the sort of area in the Indian Ocean that's closer to India, perhaps. So certainly Kenya, Ethiopia, which is not on the ocean, but Mauritius, Mozambique. So all along that coast, Tanzania, Zambia's, again, landlocked. But that area, and there's ancient, well, not ancient, but traditional ties with Indian communities in those countries as well. And for the Chinese, though, I don't see any particular geographic pattern. But certainly, it's an interesting time. There are so many different partners there, possible partners.
Exactly. And in other words, the point I was leading up to is that unlike the ex-colonial things, it may be one where they'll learn to cooperate with each other, even on the business front, as it might happen in the oil or the energy sector, for example, automotive sector, for that matter. There's a question there, please, yes.
Professor Brautigam, this has been a great presentation, and I think we've all learned an enormous amount. One of my Chinese friends said he was certain it would be translated into Chinese and would be widely read and praised.
Can I just say it's in simplified characters and complex characters already,
good.
so
Oh,
take
very
your
good,
choice.
very good. I have a couple of rather different questions and observations to ask you to comment on, and they're in no particular order. Number one, you're a China person. I mean, you trained in the China field. You got the language, and you did the academic training to be a China person and chose to do research on China and Africa. And I wonder, as we look at this new world that we're looking at now, where China is global, the United States is recognizing that China is global. The theme of the last 2 days has been all about that kind of new world. Whether you could imagine, for example, that your work could have been done by an Africanist, let's say an American Africa scholar who didn't have Chinese. So think about the ways in which China training is essential or not essential to the kind of work that you as an American and other Americans ought to be doing. That's number one. Number two, the theme of this whole Carter Center Emory conference and forum over the last couple of days has a sort of action orientation to it. The idea was, thanks to the Carter Center's role in the world, the idea is, and thanks to the whole discussion of the new relationship between major powers that President Xi Jinping and President Obama discussed at Sunnylands, the notion is we're in a new world now. We're no longer in the old kinds of Cold Wars, and we're no longer only in an economic world. We're in a world of shared and cooperative interest in big global problems. And for the Carter Center and for this community, one that stands out obviously is the Carter Center's long commitment in Africa. I wonder if you could speculate a little on just how the United States and China could actually turn good intentions into practical cooperation when you and I both know that getting things done between the U.S. and China is very complicated, even bilaterally, not only when you're working on a third country or a third region. It's hard work to get the two sides to be to get the same bed and the same dreams. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on that as well.
Thanks for those questions. I couldn't have done what I did in my research without the China background, and I think it's just enormously helpful for understanding China's going out into any different region to have that background. China's not an easy country to understand, and I can't say that I'm an expert on China. There's so much I don't know, but there's a lot of places I know where to look to find out what I need to know, and to ask the people that do know. So it was essential for me. And I see this also in the work that's done on China and Africa. The people doing the best work are those with a China background, because they have such a head start in trying to understand. And the same in China and Latin America as well. So Kevin Gallagher is one of my, we're working together on the project, and he works very closely with someone with an excellent China background. So he's learning a lot more himself, but that's really essential, to either have it or to work with someone who does. So in terms of action orientation, practical cooperation, I thought yesterday in our sessions, Joyce, you're still here. She made this point about the China-Africa cooperation, that you need patience. And it's a lot about, as we know in the China field, it's about building guanxi. It's about building relationships. It's about coming back again and again, meeting the same people, having the conversations over and over again, and really building a kind of a trust. So I found that even in doing research, that really helps to meet people over and over, have lunch with them, and so on, in order to accomplish research goals. And so I think this kind of effort, like what the Carter Center is doing now in bringing people together, they're also fostering opportunities for us to meet each other and to form relationships there. And more opportunities like this to meet and greet and eat together. And very strategically, like I would think for the Carter Center to focus on health. I know a lot of people in China working on health, people at the Chinese CDC, people working in the private pharmaceutical industry, people working on health diplomacy for the Ministry of Health and within the Ministry of Commerce. And I think it would be a really interesting meeting. Maybe it could happen in Beijing, maybe here. But to work on those, and then out of that, ideas would be generated about things that could happen. And I'm very reluctant to be involved in sort of top-down, to sit in a room in Washington and generate ideas for what should be done with the U.S., China, and Africa. But I think being part of a process of having a lot of informed stakeholders together is the way to go.
Wow. No, I'm sorry. I cannot see on this side. Please go ahead.
We have a light shining right in our eyes, so we can't see you.
Okay. Does it work or? Okay. What about the trade deficit between China and Africa? Is there a large deficit rather than a surplus?
Microphones very close to your mouth, please.
All right. Is there a large deficit in trade, like we have a trade deficit? And are they in Africa worried about, budget balancing and currency manipulation, like we are with China?
Those are good questions. Let me take the currency issue first. There is concern amongst a lot of the emerging market countries in Africa and elsewhere about what they perceive as an undervalued Chinese currency, because this also affects their exports. So they're competing with the Chinese exports in some markets. So there's concern about that. But it's interesting that it doesn't usually come out as, they don't come out and make a big statement about it. So, but I have talked to enough people to know that they wonder how much of an unfair advantage this currency has given China. But it's mostly a past issue. I would say that the appreciation now of the yuan has really brought that much more into a more realistic position. So that's not as great an issue. I don't hear much about that recently. In terms of the trade deficit, continent-wide, the trade is remarkably balanced. And so if you look at imports going into Africa,
and exports going out, it's very balanced, much more so than with us. I don't know if you could see that in my presentation. But that masks a lot of differentiation country by country. And so in some places, for example, in Angola, there's much more going out to China, much less going in. And in other places, it's the opposite, where there's much more goods coming in from China, much less going out. So it's interesting to me that I see over and over again at the Ministry of Commerce this effort to work on these trade imbalances. So they understand this is a sensitive issue. And so that's why they've been pushing to Chinese companies to relocate their manufacturing investments to Africa. They're pushing for more African exports to come in of different kinds, that they have a program of zero tariff entry, which is kind of like our Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. So there's more than 400 products have zero tariff entry from the poorest countries in Africa into China. And these are not just, in fact, most of it is not raw materials, it's processed goods. And I have the whole, the list of those products, if anyone's interested. And I was surprised to see how many were processed and semi-processed goods. So this provides a real opportunity, I think, for African governments that want to adopt more of an industrial policy to try to move up the value chain in various ways to try to take advantage of that for exporting into China. Because wage rates are going up in China. There's less and less, there's more competition at that lower end and more opportunities now. And that's going to be changing. In another 10 years, it's going to be so different than it is today at that low end.
Are they thinking of tariffs like we are to balance the trade a little bit and fix up the currency problems? And also my second short question was about how much does this Geely car cost and what's it like, the Geely car? Is it yours or what?
The Geely car, just to me, it looked like a Toyota or a Honda. You know, it just looks like a regular sedan, four-door. I don't know. You'll have to look on the internet. Very cheap, I hear, from an expert. Do you have a Geely? Oh, it's, I have no idea. I have no idea, but I can assure you that it probably has to pay a big tariff to come into South Africa.
There's a question there, and later on here there was a hand raised, which I can see through the light. So please, go ahead.
Questions.
Yeah.
I was told no more speaking, but I stood my ground and did not give up. I said, I just have to comment something. I'm not going to ask questions or take time, but I'm taking time now. I just want to thank you for clearing the picture. I felt very bad. My husband made it a point for me to come here. That is Dr. Rivera over there sitting. Attend this, especially. And I felt very bad being Chinese, looked like Chinese. But I grew up in Mumbai, Namaste ji, Jagdish said. And so the Kenya driver happens to be Kenya, and he started talking. The Chinese is not fair. They go there, bridges and overcharges and all that. I felt bad. And then yesterday I heard we have only Chinese workers. That compounded my hurt feelings as a Chinese. And I'm so glad that you clarified. And as a Chinese, I really felt. And then even though I feel very much Indian, but I look like Chinese. Every country should be. Aren't we? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question over there. There's a hand raised. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned in passing. Mentioned in passing that Huawei was now doing manufacturing in China. Are these smart?
Africa?
In Africa, sorry. What country is this in most countries? And is this smartphone assembly or is it telecom equipment assembly? And what is the best source to read about Huawei's manufacturing in Africa?
It's assembly. So, and I know it's happening in Nigeria. There's another assembly plant. I think they have one in South Africa, although I'm not sure about that. I probably better stop because I don't have a mental map in my head of where they're located around the continent, but it's not that hard to find out. You can go to their website and they have, their Africa operations, and you can see exactly where they're active. So that's easy to find out. I just don't know it. I just wanted to say something on the Indian Chinese comments. Let me say three things. I want to be realistic about some of the problems that Chinese face in Africa. They do face this problem about quality. There's a perception that Chinese goods are of lower quality. And just as we see a range of Chinese qualities in America, so do they see in Africa. And I'll just tell you one example. In Zambia, I was speaking with a Zambian colleague, and he said, yes, there's a lot of poor quality Chinese material, Chinese goods for sale here. And he said, you can find them in Kamwala Market. And that's where all the cheap things are sold, and that's where people with not much money buy. Things don't last very long. But he said, I can also go to Game, which is a South African department store, and the things I buy there are also made in China. But they're a lot more expensive, and they're a lot higher quality. So there's this recognition, I think, that there's a price range, and things at the low end, you get what you pay for. But a lot of that quality is not good. In terms of business practices, I mentioned yesterday that according to the Pew polls, U.S. business practices got approval. About, I think it was 74% or so people in Africa, in the countries that were polled, approved of U.S. business practices. Only 59% approved of Chinese business practices. That's still not bad. 59% is better than 29%, but it could be better. So there are concerns there. And in terms of labor, there are some countries and some projects in which you will find a large Chinese labor force. Angola is an example. Lots of Chinese workers there. Sudan, there are also lots of Chinese workers there. We saw in Libya and in Algeria. Those are the 4 places where you will find lots and lots of Chinese workers. But in other places, you'll have the Chinese management tier, which is about 20% will be Chinese. And this could be 50 people. So it'll look like a lot if you see them. But then all of the workers will be African, and they will be, it's a lot cheaper than bringing them from China. Makes sense.
Any other question? Yes, please, yes.
Got a chance to ask my question to Deborah. Thank you. At first, it's all well inspiring, and then I just want to ask a question related with your area development, because you've been observing Chinese presence in Africa for so many years. My question goes to, it's nothing, it's maybe you didn't touch upon very much in your presentation, but I know you are still doing your observation, traveling in China and Africa. So I really wonder, what do you think of in long term, the development China has been brought into Africa continent? Anything different from Chinese own experiences? And then yesterday we heard about the Coca-Cola, what they've done. They said they not only buy their license, they also buy social license, all this kind of issue which related with both culture and then your development issue in long term. So I really wonder, in terms of Africans' long-term development, what kind of a positive really China has brought, if there is, and then comparatively with other countries, this is external development and then their internal development, what kind of element you observed so far? Thank you.
I'm a firm believer that development happens inside. I mean, it happens domestically. And people change, policies change, and that's what generates development. So I think China's an excellent example of that. After 1978, look what happened in China with different leaders and different policies. So in any African country, that's what's going to generate development. And I don't think the Chinese are going to do, they're not going to develop Africa. That's not their job. But what they can do in countries that are serious about development and that want more opportunities, they offer a lot more choices. They have a lot of finance. They have a lot of interested companies. And so I see this in places like Ethiopia, where I think the United States still thinks of Ethiopia as a place that there's a famine around the next corner, and that's all that we can do there is try to rescue them. The Chinese see, and there's a business opportunity around the next corner, and we better get in there and invest. And so it's a very different perspective. So if maybe 2 things ultimately. One is that change of mindset that others are now, again, looking at Africa as a place where you can do business. It's not easy. There are a lot of challenges, but
there can be, and I think like with Coca-Cola, business can be a generator of development. And then the second thing is the ideas that China presents a model. I'm not sure that the model of state authoritarian capitalism is one that necessarily is going to work across Africa, and I wouldn't be advocating. But there are a lot of experiments that happen and a lot of ways in which they try to figure out their own path forward and learn from others. And I think that's what China provides, another area where African governments and African civil society can go to learn about what they can do. And they can evaluate how it's worked in China. They can see the terrible environmental problems. They can try to avoid that as they move up. And they can also learn from things that Chinese have done right. So that's what I think is the most useful, that China can be an example. And people can learn from that about how to do it at home.
That I have a follow-up question on that one. As you know, if you look at the US engagement in Africa or rest of the world, the civil organizations have been a very strong element, both NGOs or faith-based organizations, whatever the reason is. They've done a wonderful job in the way they have contributed toward those countries. Is China going to also then have large civic organizations? Wait. Let's debate a little. Let's debate it. What oh. Okay. What's your view about China having their own large civil organizations, not only for their own domestic issues, but also for globalization aspects of China?
Well, on the positive side, I think civil society has developed enormously inside China. If you look since 1978, just the number of non-governmental organizations, the number of civil society organizations has increased enormously. Some of these are what we would call either quangos, quasi-NGOs, or gongos, government NGOs. So there's a question about just how independent they are. But in Africa, there's been very, very little Chinese civil society engagement. It's almost negligible. There are a few examples of Chinese environmental organizations that have now started to make common cause with African environmental organizations, and I think that's a very positive development. But there's not very much else happening. There's maybe some education cooperation that would be civil society based. But other than that, it's not happening. I do think civil society and NGOs have a really positive role to play. I think in Africa, we had gotten to a point in our aid relationship where we were kind of thinking that NGOs might develop Africa. And I don't think that's the way to go for development. I don't think any country in the world has been developed through microfinance and NGOs that can help. It can certainly help, but that's not the way. That's not the way to really move forward. So even though my great aunt was a medical missionary, and I told you in Nepal, and I built a hospital there, that was helpful. But that's look where Nepal is today. So
I think we have one last question, please. Yes.
Well, then you've got 54 countries in Africa. They all have different labor costs. So if you're looking at South Africa, it's hugely more than in China. It's South African labor. I remember in Zambia, I remember a Chinese person at the Ministry of Finance, an official, who was answering a question about labor disputes in Chinese mining companies in Zambia. And he said, you know what, the miners in Zambia, what they're demanding for wages right now is more than I make in my job. So he said these are very expensive workers. So that can happen. But it's in some countries, certainly the unofficial wage rates are, well, I'll tell you one story. In Nigeria, I interviewed a Nigerian entrepreneur who was doing joint ventures with Chinese entrepreneurs, and they have factories in the East. And I said to him, he's making plastics. And I said, how can you be competitive about plastics? Because I've heard that the Chinese imports had wiped out the plastics industry in Nigeria. And yet here I see you producing, like you have 800 African workers, Nigerian workers here, and you're producing night and day. And how can you be successful? And he said, he brings all his equipment from China. He said, I pay my workers the same that workers are paid in China. And he said, I've got my raw materials here in Nigeria because it's petrochemicals. And I've got distribution networks all around Nigeria and in the neighboring countries. And he said, my quality's better, my prices are cheaper, and I can outcompete any Chinese export. So that's not happening in very many places. There's still Chinese experts are out competing African entrepreneurs in most cases, but the opportunity is there. And the labor wage rates that he was paying were the same, and they're going up a lot faster in China.
Last question, and I know I have 1 minute left, so Deborah, please. Oh, I'm so sorry, yes.
How do you assess Chinese-African Cooperation Forum?
The Chinese in 2000 set up something called the FOCOC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And this was followed very quickly by the Forum on China-Caribbean Cooperation and the China-South Pacific Cooperation Forum and the China-Lusophone Countries Cooperation Forum. And there's one with ASEAN and in the Middle East. So there are a lot of different cooperation fora. And these are, to me, in Africa, this is set up largely to provide economies of scale because 54 countries, you want to have good relations with all of them. How can you get them all together? So every 3 years, they have these meetings, and they are able to hear a lot of ideas and then also to present areas of cooperation where it's kind of one size fits all. So they'll roll out, right now they're doing 25 of these agricultural cooperation demonstration farms, and they've got these economic and trade cooperation zones, and like hospitals would be like 20 built across and 100 primary schools. And so they can just do one thing and it can be spread through a lot of countries. So it hasn't worked. In 2006, it was remarkable how many African leaders came to Beijing for the Beijing summit of that. But then the next meeting you didn't get as many leaders coming. And so...
Oh, they went to India.
Well, yeah, maybe they did. So I think it certainly served its function. And I think it helps a lot to coordinate the relationship across the continent. And I think it's been quite successful compared to even India's trying now. Japan had something before. The Chinese kind of modeled theirs on what the Japanese had been done. But they've been much more successful than the Japanese have in their own effort. And now, as I heard, I think the United States is doing something. So.
The last question, if it's okay, do you see China and India getting together while the rest of the world is saying they are going to be emerging rivals and all this stuff? What do you see?
No.
No. That's a great short answer. Thank you very much. Thank you again.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.